Well, thanks very much, everybody, for coming along again. This is the second in what we hope is a series of presentations on the achievement scheme. Basically, these are materials, as I said last week, that we would normally have delivered at achievement scheme roadshows that were normally we'd hold 2 a year, different locations around the country, but for obvious reasons under the current circumstances they're not on, so we're doing these Zoom presentations instead. The one from last week proved very popular, so we're hoping the same with this one. This week's subject is the philosophy of the scheme and basically some of the nuts and bolts of how it works, and also some of the more recent developments in the scheme. My name's Duncan McClure. I'm as Andy's labelled me, the FAC controller, achievement scheme controller. Andy, who's been doing all the chat up to now, he's one of the full-time members of staff, BMFA. He's club support officer. Basically we're going to run the meeting between us. I'm going to run through the presentation, and Andy's going to pay attention for your questions and raising your hands, etc., etc. But as I say, if there's stuff that's pertinent while we're going along, quite happy to take questions during the presentation, but equally there'll be plenty of time at the end. The presentation isn't too long, should take no more than about 10 or 15 minutes, so there's ample time for questions at the end. What I should say is there are also other members, as well as myself and Andy, there are other members of the Achievement Scheme Review Committee who are joining us in the presentation tonight. So hopefully we'll be able to handle any of the questions you might have between us. And I think that's about all I want to say before we crack on. Okay, I hope you enjoy. I'll try not to talk too quickly or go too fast. Okay, so this is what we're going to look at in the short presentation tonight. So basic principles of philosophy of the scheme, how it's run, what the ASRC and myself as controller do, and a summary of some of the recent developments. Andy will tell me off for recent because some of them are sort of 6 or 7 years old now, but it's a list of some of the more recent things that have changed and been developed within the achievement scheme. Oh, wait. Okay, so most important thing about the achievement scheme, it's not a license. It's something that's entirely voluntary, and it's there just to give the guys at the field on a Sunday afternoon the opportunity to have goals and targets to encourage them to improve their flying and their safety and just their general behavior. It's not it's not compulsory at all. It's an entirely voluntary scheme, and as I've said on the screen, you can see all the things here. I'll try not to do PowerPoint karaoke. It's just something there to encourage people to help them develop and give them something to aim for. The interesting thing is, even for quite competent pilots, if they haven't actually had a go at running through the various maneuvers required for all the different tests, then they should expect to have to practice. And the two most important things are in red at the bottom of the screen. There are absolutely no implications for your insurance, whether you have an achievement scheme certificate or not. And there are actually no implications for display flying. Many years ago, there were recommendations relating to having a B test to be eligible to fly at model flying displays. But that requirement has now been removed from the BMFA handbook. There's still some suggestions that it might be a good thing. The reason it's not there, or it's not so important, is the important thing is actually the legal responsibility for the competence of pilots at a public display rests with the display organizer. And we didn't want to muddy the waters there in any way, shape or form. So those are the two most important things there at the bottom of the screen. But the other thing, not a license, entirely voluntary, not compulsory. Other important things about the scheme, it's a common national standard. Well, we do our best to ensure it's a common national standard. And what we have our individual areas run on behalf of the achievement scheme are a series of workshops each year run by the areas in their areas. Some areas are good. They may do 2 or 3 a year at different locations, different clubs in the area. Some areas aren't able to do quite as many for whatever reason. But they're a good way of helping us ensure consistency between examiners. They're labeled examiner instructor workshops, but also over time, variables. So it's really something for everyone, although they're labeled examiner instructor workshops. And if you're not sure whether your area runs any, or for whatever reason, you can either your first port of call really should be your area. Go and ask them. Go and ask your achievement scheme coordinator for your area. And if you don't know who that is, don't worry. You can always ask Andy or I. Other most important things about the scheme is it's delivered entirely by volunteers. Okay, Andy's the exception here. He's one of the handful of BMFA full-time staff. The rest of the BMFA is really run by volunteers. There are quite literally dozens or so of various technical committees, and who are all volunteers, like myself and like the other members of the ASRC. And some of us are lucky enough to be retired, but many of these guys still have full-time day jobs. And also all of the area chief examiners and instructors and the club examiners and instructors, they're all volunteers. They all do this job because they want to give something back to the sport. But I think it's often a misconception. So often I see, because Andy and I get a significant number of emails from the membership, and so often I see the phrase along the lines of the BMFA needs to do something about this. And actually, the BMFA is a very democratic organisation, and most of the BMFA are volunteers, just ordinary flyers like us, who enjoy being up the field on a Sunday afternoon and flying our model airplanes, hopefully. Okay, so moving on. So hopefully you're all aware that there are currently 3 basic levels of certification. We have the A test and the BPC, exactly the same test, often regarded as safe solo. Again, not necessarily a label that we would we support that phrase, but it's how clubs adopt it and use it that people often see it this way. So important thing here is the A and the BPC are the same test, as I've said. The difference between them is what type of aircraft you turn up with to take the test. And basically, if you have an aircraft that doesn't have an undercarriage from which it can ROG, you, irrespective of weight or whatever, or mass, whatever, you take a BPC. If you have an aircraft that's fitted with any form of additional stabilization, so maybe it's one of E-flights with an AS3X receiver in or whatever, then you'll take a BPC. And the other is if it's under a kilogram, then you'll take a BPC. But it's exactly the same test. There's also an FPV extension now for people who have A's and BPCs. Then you have the B test, which is slightly more advanced than the A, and then you have the C tests, which are special endorsements to your B. The current C tests that are available are for aerobatics, scale, and gas turbine, but not a huge uptake of those specialist endorsements. Important thing to say about them is they're not necessarily harder than the B. They're just a specialist endorsement for that particular type of aircraft.
We've got a question from Craig Rathmar.
Yeah.
Puts his hand up. I'll better find him on the list and unmute. Yeah, if you have got a question, if you can put your hand up, please. It does mean that you move up the top of my list so I can find you there. Right, Craig, your question.
Yeah, Duncan, just with the C scale.
Yep.
Does it have to be a scale-built aircraft, or can I go and take my Flightline Spitfire, which is kind of scale? Can I fly the scale with that? Oh,
absolutely, yes. Yes, so long as it's a scale aircraft, so long as it's not a Watt 4, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's an E-flight foamy Spitfire or whatever, yes, you're absolutely fine. The scale C is interesting. It has a slightly different concept to the other two, and the primary reason it was introduced, this is my understanding, it happened just as I joined ASRC, was that it was there to hopefully encourage people into scale flying. So I think the scale community had tried a variety of different classes to try and encourage people to get involved in scale flying, and they felt that a scale endorsement, a C endorsement in the achievement scheme might also help. So we sort of said, why not? But it doesn't. It's slightly different to the gas turbine and the aerobatics, which are just really meant for those particular disciplines. The scale was there to hopefully encourage more people into scale flying. But having said that, not been massive uptake. But that's true for all of the C certificates.
I think we've got to realise that the C certificates are difficult.
Yes, yeah,
and they're designed to be difficult, so there's not going to be a lot of people pass them, but that's not entirely the point. If we've got hundreds and hundreds of people passing the C aerobatics, I think it'd be safe to say that the test was too easy. It's more gives you people something to aim for, and the fact that you're aiming for it does improve your standards.
Yeah. Well, we've got another question, Andy.
We have indeed. We've got a couple, actually. Let's unmute John Minchell. John?
Hi, just the C scale test. I'm currently the PRO for the Scale Tech Committee. I've spoken to a number of the top scale guys, and I don't think many of them have tried it, but it's basically just you fly a scale competition flight with all of the choice and compulsory manoeuvres, as opposed to what Duncan was saying, where the aerobatics and the gas turbine is not actually necessarily a competition flight as you would do. That's all I was just trying to get across, really.
Okay, sorry, good point. Thanks. Andy, just before we move on, have you got that strange box in the middle of the top of your screen again?
Yes.
Okay, it keeps fading in and out on mine.
Yeah, it's fading in and out on mine.
So, I'll ignore it.
Yeah, I would.
Okay. Oh, don't you just love tech? Right,
yeah.
Moving on.
John Beck, you did have your hand up for a question. Has it been answered, or?
No, it hasn't.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to ask it, but I'm not sure how relevant it is. It's regarding, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's regarding, I realise that the A test, it's all about, in our club we have people who do the bronze first, so they can practice for their A. And a few of the people are saying that because electric is a lot easier than petrol, if they pass the test, the bronze, with the electric, then if they then go out and buy a petrol, they need to do another bronze test to prove that they can manage it safely.
Yeah. That's not something that's not a rule that's come from the achievement scheme. That must be a club rule.
Yeah, it's more of a club rumour than a rule, really. It's
because that's one of the fundamentals of the scheme is we don't actually attribute any privileges as a result of gaining an A or a B or a C. Lots of clubs do that, but it's actually not the achievement scheme in itself. So that's quite an important distinction to make, actually.
Yeah. So the BPC then is basically if you've got a plane without wheels or it's under 200 grams,
under a kilogram, or can't ROG or has some form of stabilization.
Yeah. Yes.
Then it's okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
All right.
Right. Lovely. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.
Great.
No. Okay. Moving on.
Yeah.
So I think this is the most important thing I want to say here is that the scheme is actually run by our clubs, by affiliated clubs in the areas. It's the clubs that nominate and appoint club examiners and instructors. It's the areas that nominate and appoint area chief examiners and instructors. And each of the areas has a coordinator that coordinates the activities of the scheme within their area, as well as looking after all of the area chief examiners, and being the focal point for contact for area clubs for when they want a club examiner test or a club instructor test or whatever. But it's very important that everybody appreciates that I don't really run the scheme, Andy doesn't run the scheme, ASRC doesn't really run the scheme. The nuts and bolts of it are done at grassroots level by clubs and areas, well, clubs in particular. And we'd be lost without them, really. Club examiners are absolutely vital to the delivery of the scheme, and there's we rely on them totally to do that. So they're very important. And the other important thing at the bottom of the screen, as it says here, is that the club examiners and area chief examiners, they're not like an A certificate or a B certificate. They're not awards for life. They are only annual appointments. So all examiners, whether they're club examiners or area chief examiners, and the same with instructors, is they have to be re-ratified on an annual basis. So if say, for example, I wasn't put forward by my area to be an area chief examiner for the coming year, I would lose that qualification. Their appointment's not a qualification, rather. Andy, I've got some of that strange scribbling up here again as well. I don't know.
I've no idea where that's coming from.
Nope. I didn't move anything my end because I was being super careful.
Yeah, well, it's on your screen, so.
Yeah, I know. I mean, what I could do is start again, and just skip along to this slide. What do you reckon?
No, yeah, just carry on. We'll do what we did last week. And yeah.
Okay, moving on. So this is kind of in response to some of the questions that we had during last week's presentation. This is the which I talked through, but this is how a club goes about appointing a club examiner. First of all, they identify that they've got a need and a suitable candidate. They then contact their area coordinator. The area coordinator will appoint an appropriate area chief examiner to conduct the test. That might be one. That might be an area chief examiner who's geographically close, or it may be a different examiner for some other reason. Perhaps the two guys are best mates, and it wouldn't look good if one tested the other, so we choose somebody else. And basically, the candidate is then tested. They fly the appropriate B schedule for whatever the discipline or disciplines the examiner is going to be appointed in. And then there's a bit of role reversal between the candidate and the area chief that's conducting the test, where the candidate would then take the area chief examiner through either a mock A or B test, preferably both, but if they've only got time for one, that's fine. And then there's a bit of an interview process, and then either the candidate is appointed or rejected. And it's pretty much the same process for a club instructor, for approved instructors. Say a little bit more about instructors in the next slide, but I see we've got a question.
We do, from Joseph. Joseph, you've got a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what, if any, are the prerequisites of becoming a club examiner or an approved instructor?
There aren't any, really.
Well, there are.
Yes, I guess. Okay, you have to, if you want to become an examiner, you have to have held the appropriate B certificate for the last 6 months. And if you want to become an approved instructor, you have to have held an appropriate A certificate for the last 6 months.
Okay,
I think the other requirement for becoming a club examiner is the club needs to want you to be a club examiner.
Yes.
Because the club has to put you forward.
Yeah,
that's quite an important thing. It's not something you can just decide to do. It does require the club to decide they have a need, and the club to think that you're suitable.
Yeah,
and then to retain the standard, a club examiner as well requires you to maintain your BMFA membership, but also requires a club to ratify you on an annual basis.
Okay, so that's just ratification is just them saying that, yeah, we'd like to carry him or her
Yep.
forward as a.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no formal reassessment or anything like that. It's just really the club or the area indicating that they've been happy with what you've been doing for the last 12 months. Because this is why only clubs really can run it. Because Andy and I, you know, even though I have the title of scheme controller, I have no idea what the 600 or 700 club examiners out there are doing on a day-to-day basis. Only their clubs do. So that's why we have to rely on the clubs to fulfil that role. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, fantastic.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Question on the clubs and examiners as well from John Collister.
If you wanted to become an examiner and your club didn't need one, but you wanted to become one, what could you do about that?
Persuade them that they I don't think the club could. I mean, there are in the handbook there's broad guidance on number of examiners in a club, but that's just for guidance. So there is no hard and fast rule about how many examiners a club can have. And from a personal point of view, I don't think they can have too many, because you can't always guarantee that guys will be available. And to my mind, the what really helps drive the scheme forward is when you've nearly always got examiner at the field, you know, there on a Sunday afternoon with all the guys doing come on, Fred, why don't you have a go at doing your test? I've been watching you for a few weeks now. You're more than competent, etc., etc. So, but it as Andy said, well, as it says on the slide, it's a club appointment. So if your club don't want you as an examiner, then the only thing, your other option really is to try and find another club that might want you as an examiner.
Okay.
Okay.
Moving on then.
Okay, moving on. Okay, so I mentioned briefly instructors. Important thing about instructors here, approved, qualified and area chief instructors are the only ones that are administered by the ASRC and myself, and because registered examiners are now just club appointments. The reason they're club appointments is there isn't a test, and the candidates aren't required to have any form of certification. So you can be a registered instructor without an A or a BPC or any of the other achievement scheme awards. Whereas for an approved instructor, you have to have an A certificate, and for a qualified, you have to have a B certificate. The interesting thing is, if you're tested and you have an A certificate and you become an approved instructor, if at some later date you gain a B certificate in whatever discipline, then you can automatically become a qualified instructor on application to the scheme controller. So you just have to send an email or whatever saying, I've got my B certificate, can I be a qualified instructor? And the answer is yes, basically. It's an automatic process.
Another question.
Got a question?
Joseph? Yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I've seen before that to become a qualified instructor, you have to have had the B certificate for 6 months. Is that still the case?
Correct, yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, right, lovely. Moving on, nearly there. Here's just some interesting facts about the scheme. We've got 16,000 of our members, so roughly half total BMFA membership have at least one certificate. And there are something like 20-odd thousand certificates out there amongst all the current existing membership. We've currently got 92 area chief examiners spread over the 14 areas, and we're roughly 700 club examiners and somewhere in the region of 3,000 club instructors. And there are generally somewhere in the region of 600 new certificates gained each year. I mean, that does vary. And I haven't done a detailed analysis of it, but looking at it, you can surprise, you can correlate the number of awards in a year with the sort of summer that we've had. In other words, if we've had a good summer, the numbers are up, and if we haven't had a good summer, the numbers are down. Surprise, surprise. One interesting fact that I will mention here is, you remember some years ago, there was a bit of controversy when we introduced the mandatory questions. to the tests, and there was a lot of speculation that, because it was speculation, well, as anecdotal hearsay evidence that it had put people off the test. Now, I'm not doubting that the individuals that reported this were accurately relaying their personal experience, but the bottom line was the year following the introduction of the mandatory questions, we had a significant increase in the number of successful tests. So again, I think it's more to do with the weather than anything else. Okay.
I think the important thing there is we've had a significant decrease in the number of emails asking about the lawful requirements of model flying because more people know them.
Yes. Okay, so moving on. So what does the ASRC do? Sorry, Achievement Scheme Review Committee. It's a subcommittee of the Areas Council. So Areas Council is made up of the 14 delegates that represent each of the BMFA areas. And as it says here, there are 7 members of that committee. It's a 2-year appointment for everybody who's on the committee, but some of those retire in even years and some of them retire in odd years, just to help us have a little bit of continuity on the committee. The Areas Council have an obligation to make sure that the makeup of the ASRC has a suitable range of skills and disciplines. And I'm pleased to say that all the time that I've been either on the ASRC or Scheme Controller, it always has done. The interesting thing is, if there's, say, a new developing area, and the classic example in recent years has been things like multi-rotors, where we perhaps didn't have expertise on the committee, we would invite individuals along with expertise in those fields, basically to pick their brains and see where we should be going and what we might be able to offer by way of tests for those disciplines. And actually what happened over the years, one of those or several of those individuals have actually turned into full-time members of the committee. So because they've just applied to be on the committee and were voted on by Areas Council. So that's kind of how, and the Achievement Scheme Review Committee is really responsible for all of the developments in the scheme. And so new tests, changes to tests, etc., etc. And some of those, as you've seen in recent years, some of those developments have been forced by regulatory changes as much as anything else. And as it says at the bottom, 2 additional members to the 7 that are voted by Areas Council are the Scheme Controller, and mine again, the Scheme Controller is voted on by full council. But Andy, as Club Support Officer, automatically has a seat on the ASRC, although he's non-voting. But Andy's, and the justification is a really good reason that Andy's on the has standing seat, that's good, isn't it, on the ASRC, is because he gets the bulk of the emails from members. So he's a really good conduit between the membership and the office and the rest of the ASRC. At same, to a lesser extent, myself as Scheme Controller. Scheme Controller also attracts a reasonable amount of email traffic. Okay, moving on. This is the important bit about the ASRC. I said they're responsible for developing all of the scheme materials. They're also responsible for an annual review. There's an annual review of every single test, and there's something that I think we're up to 21 or 22 tests now within the scheme. But every year, towards the end of the year, the committee sit down and look at all the feedback that we've received during the year about all the various tests. So if you've got a gripe, or you think there's something not quite right, or you think there's a typo or whatever, because there's bound to be typos or things that aren't quite spelled out in enough detail to be to make it obvious exactly what we're looking for. We look at all that evidence and we sit down and review it and change the documents accordingly. They may be very minor changes. Rarely are there major changes, but the important thing is they are reviewed annually. We start that process in September, October, so that by the 1st of December, we can publish online all of the draft new materials for the coming year. and providing there aren't any horrendous howlers or errors or whatever, they all then go live on the 1st of January that year. And how do you know that you've got a current or up-to-date document? They're all dated for the particular year. So if you've got a copy of, say, an A certificate guidance document, say, for example, and it's got 2018 on it, it's not the right one. If it's not got 2020 on it, it's not the current document. The only time we ever change documents during the year is if there's a major safety reason or regulatory change. And I think 2019 was the only year we've ever had to do that in recent times, Andy.
Yes, when they introduced the flight restriction zones, we needed to update some of the questions, didn't we, for the mandatory questions? Yeah,
so the CAA regulatory change. So there were issue 2s for 2019. Okay. The other thing the ASRC does is if there are any anomalies or queries or disputes within the scheme, thankfully extremely rare. I've been on ASRC and or controller for over a decade now, and I don't think we've ever removed anybody's certificates. The normal anomalies and queries are, I've lost my certificate. Andy has to do a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes job on the old database, if we're going back at all in time, to try and identify if we can see whether the individual was tested or not. Because unfortunately, historically, going back a long way, the records aren't 100% foolproof. And also, the other thing ASRC does is it provides a regular report to BMFA full council meetings. And one of the things it's worth saying here is that there is now really good recognition of the value of the achievement scheme by BMFA full council. I think what's really brought it all to light has been all the recent negotiations with the EASA and CAA and the DFT over the drone regulations, etc. And I think it's been a real benefit to the association to demonstrate that we have a system put in place to enable people to improve their standards of flying and safety, and basically that we're a responsible operator in the way we behave. So it's been, and there's been really good full council recognition of the importance of the achievement scheme. It may sound trivial, but what they're actually doing now is on full council agendas, rather than achievement scheme stuff appearing right at the end of a very long and tedious day, they're much higher up on the agenda schedule, and we can talk about the things that are important to a lot of people earlier on in the meeting. Sorry, I saw a hand up there at some point, Andy.
Yes, that's John Collister again, about examiners again. I'll go for it. John.
Go for it, John.
Is there any thought being given to the periodic reassessment of examiners? I've heard stories of examiners who have obviously been doing it for a long, long time and might not have moved with the times.
We had a couple of years ago, we had a serious look at what we called continued competence. And again, it's very difficult for us, individuals like Andy or myself, or even the rest of the committee, as I said before, to actually administer the scheme without it becoming too draconian. So we rely totally on the clubs. What we have done is given the clubs and areas a little bit more guidance in terms of what we would expect examiners to be able to do. And coming out of that, I think the most positive thing was we think, and there are exceptions, but we think generally examiners should be able to demonstrate the B schedule for which, for whatever disciplines that they're qualified in.
But they only have to do that once.
We thought, well, no, we thought about it long and hard. And there was an awful lot of discussion and an awful lot of input from lots of different sources. But that was the best advice we felt we could give to clubs and areas. Now, how they interpret that and then what they do is really down to them. Because we can't, it's not for us to tell a club that Joe Bloggs is suitable to be examiner or not. So that's why I was saying right at the beginning, we rely totally on clubs and areas to actually run the scheme for us.
But as I understand it, there are some examiners, still examiners, who aren't even active flyers anymore. So they can't demonstrate it because they don't even fly anymore.
Well, then their club should be, taking the appropriate measures.
Yeah, I mean, the power is in the hand of the club. They're the ones that
Yeah.
are ratifying them on a yearly basis.
Yes, yes. So if the clubs choose not to ratify them, then that would be understandable under those circumstances.
Have
But I
these
say,
sort of guidelines been sent out to the clubs so they
yes,
know?
yeah,
it
and
shouldn't
they're,
be?
Oh, yeah.
they're in all the achievement scheme documents.
Yeah.
A question from Craig.
Go on, Craig.
Just about the examiners and competency,
Mhm.
more sort of ability I'm going to go with. I'm a fixed wing pilot. I don't fly multi-rotor, but as an examiner, I can take an A on a multi-rotor or a heli. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, any examiner can do any A test.
Right. So how do we get around well, you don't know what you're doing?
Well, you've got the very detailed guidance for all of the tests. I mean, okay, so for some of the tests, we now have videos.
Yeah.
And that's an area that we're intended to expand. But for all of the tests, there's a very detailed guidance document. They're all available, free downloads on the Achievement Scheme website. So as you as an examiner, if you've got something that's slightly out of your comfort zone, you can go and pull the guidance document, because the guidance documents are there for examiners as well as candidates.
Yeah.
So it tells
the case of as long as I'm satisfied that they are flying the schedule that's prescribed,
correct,
and all the rest of it.
Yep.
I don't need to understand the inner workings of how this DJI thingamajig works.
No, not you can. We did a guidance video on various stability modes for multi-rotors. It was the very first video we did, and that was just to be able to demonstrate to instruct examiners what to look for in terms of how the different stability modes manifest in the performance of the machine. So if it does this, say for example, then this level of stabilization is turned on, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So because that was difficult to do in words, the guidance document would have been about a foot thick, which is what prompted the first video, and things have, if you excuse the pun, taken off from there. And the other thing I would say to you is, don't be afraid to tap into your area chiefs, to your area coordinator. If you've read the guidance and it's still not clear, don't be afraid to pick up the phone. You can even give me a call if you like, or whatever. Just don't be afraid to seek widened guidance. But hopefully, it's all in the written guidance document.
Yeah, from what I've read, it's pretty comprehensive and everything. My concern is maybe just over the validity of it. Could that be questioned? Could somebody else say, "Well, hang on, you fly fixed wing, you don't fly rotary, but you're assessing him"?
It's been this way for decades, and it's never really caused a problem.
I think it's the prevalence now of drones.
Yeah, sure. But you can cite the guidance, you can cite the video that demonstrates the various stability modes. So, yeah, just go for it.
Okay, moving on.
Right. Yeah, I think we're nearly there now. Okay, so what do I do? Well, you've already seen I'm a member of the Achievement Scheme Controller. I currently do the silent flight and the power roles. I do fly both disciplines, and really, Achievement Scheme Controller is largely an admin role. So how you administer the silent flight guys and the power flyers, it's identically, they're both the same. So it does make sense to combine the two roles. I'm responsible for the promotion of the scheme at all levels, as you might imagine. And as I said earlier, I, rather like Andy, I get an awful lot of member emails, so I end up answering them lots of questions. So often it's RTFM for those. I'm sure most of you know what RTFM means, and it's just making sure that everybody follows the rules. Occasionally, I have to act as an arbiter, and again, occasionally I'll refer things to the ASRC if I think it's something interesting that deserves wider debate and discussion. I also have to provide reports to full council. But I think the most important thing to say here about Scheme Controller is I actually have very little power. I can't make appointments. I can't remove qualifications or whatever. And I think that's quite right. I think that's quite powerful, that the guy who actually administers the scheme and makes sure everybody follows the rules doesn't have any right in terms of taking draconian action. If you look in the Achievement Scheme Handbook and the BMFA Handbook, all the processes for removal of awards or certificates or whatever, or retests, they're really all based around clubs and areas, surprise, surprise. Rather like I said at the beginning. Okay. And this is the final part of the presentation, are things that have changed in the scheme over recent years. And Andy always tells me off for recent, because we've been doing examiner workshops now. Examiner instructor workshops to 2013. I know John Harris, he's a member of the ASRC, is with us tonight, and I always regard John as the godfather of the workshop. His area have been running workshops for probably like 2 or 3 decades now, and I actually went along to hit one of his area workshops to take my helicopter to B many years ago. Thought it was a really good idea. We turned it into, with the help of the ASRC, turned it into a national initiative, which now most areas embrace and run workshops. And they're really enjoyable days, because we keep saying to people, don't forget, the main part of the reason we do this sport is to have fun. And actually, examiner instructor workshops, really great experience for not only examiners and instructors, but also aspiring test candidates. And it's quite often at the end of a workshop, there'll be opportunity for individuals to take tests. So great initiative, and I'd encourage everyone to go and experience one at some time when we can, COVID-19 aside. Other recent developments, something I've already mentioned in the presentation, was the multi-rotor A and B tests, which we introduced in 2014, and alongside them was the very first video we did that I've discussed, that we use as a method of demonstrating how the various stability modes might work. A flying start is the new flight training manual. I'm sure some of you will remember Up and Away, which was the original BMFA publication written by John Long. For many years was the BMFA flight training manual. Unfortunately, it hadn't been reviewed and updated on an annual basis, so it had got seriously out of date. The achievement scheme, we asked John Long, because he had copyright, could we rewrite it and take over, and he gave us his blessing. So it's now an achievement scheme document that's reviewed like every one of the other achievement scheme documents, but it was renamed the Flying Start, incorporates more electric, and also brought things up to date. Achievement scheme handbook grew to the extent that it was overtaking the BMFA handbook, and also the BMFA members handbook wasn't then currently reviewed and updated every year, and so the achievement scheme elements were falling behind. They were out of sync with the various guidance documents for the various tests. So we took the achievement scheme materials out, generated a dedicated achievement scheme handbook, which is now reviewed annually like all the other documents. Also the same year, 2016, basic proficiency certificates were introduced. Said a bit about those already during the presentation. So for aircraft that don't qualify for the A test, although it's the same test, you can take a BPC. Also mentioned the mandatory questions with the various legislative changes that we could see were coming on the horizon. We wanted to demonstrate that the scheme was taking a responsible approach towards all our model flying. So we introduced those. Important thing about the mandatory questions is a lot of people kept saying, "Oh, why have you introduced these new questions?" And one of the things that Andy and I always said was, actually, they're not new. Most of the mandatory questions were questions that I, as an examiner, have been asking for decades, and the same with Andy and many of the other examiners. So all we did was actually formalize some questions that have been around for quite some time. FPV extension, because there's a lot of people flying FPV out there for A's and BPCs. They were introduced last year. I've got another slide, I think, with more recent developments. Achievement Scheme Awards, which we talked about last week. If you missed last week's presentation, you can watch it again on YouTube, tell you all about how the Achievement Scheme Awards work and why we have them. The other thing we introduced in 2017 were the roadshows. And again, I've mentioned that this presentation would have formed part of a roadshow. The roadshows were, as the name suggests, they were traveling shows. We would go around the country. We picked 2 locations geographically different each year, and travel to those locations to try and spread the word around the country. But of course, with the current coronavirus situation, we can't do those, so hence we're doing these Zoom presentations. And the other thing we introduced were achievement scheme weekends at Buckminster. We had 2 very successful ones last year and the year before. Were growing in popularity, and hopefully we'll be able to return to them one day. Again, it's a mixture of just come along and fly and get some guidance. We arrange for as many examiners, instructors, and members of the ASRC to be there as we can. And it's just a bit of a come along, get guidance for a take a test, or take a test if you want, or we can talk you through how to run a workshop if you're interested. If you haven't run a workshop before and you're interested in running one. So they're anything and everything achievement scheme based, but they prove to be very popular and updated as required on an annual basis.
There's been 13,500 it was introduced. Yeah.
That's for members who currently don't have an achievement scheme certificate and would rather do a BMFA certificate or test rather than do the CAA online test.
Yeah, it exempts you from needing the CAA flyer ID, and it costs an awful lot less to do than the CAA system. With a couple more questions. Is your next slide the last one anyway?
It is. Yes. So the last one, future developments. This year, our target is to complete helicopter A and B videos. We also would like to redo or do a more specific multi-rotor A and B videos, but the helicopters are priority. And we also, other videos that we thought we might be useful to prepare is, as it says here, how to prepare for a test, what you do on the day, what you do in advance, etc. Or how some of the things that I've described in the slides today, how you go about appointing a club examiner and everything. A video format's so much easier to digest. So these are our ideas of what we might introduce going forward. But we'd love to receive feedback, even if it's not always positive, but we do like to have some feedback, because otherwise how can we develop and move things forward? And the other 2 items on the slide, the roadshows and the Buckminster events, those are things that we will continue. We have every intention of continuing going forward.